From Software has made a lot of Souls games over the years, and despite enjoying all of them, I can honestly say I have never been so enamored by the boss fights like I have in Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. But what has changed from the boss fights of the older titles compared to the boss fights of Sekiro? The answer is options. The option to choose how to approach the flow of battle, how to react to enemy attacks, how to punish every opening, and how From Software can restrict these options to make the flow of boss fights evolve in very different ways. Now, the first thing you need to understand is how the older titles did things. After all, if Sekiro is changing the formula by allowing more options to defeat your enemies and manage their attacks, that implies that the older titles didn't have nearly as many options. And by looking at Dark Souls 3, the last Souls title From Software created, I can explain how. Now, at first glance, the idea that Dark Souls 3 provides less combat options would seem like a farce, as the game has a massive variety of weapons ranging from spears to hammers to magic. But despite this array of different items, once you're in a boss battle, they all inevitably follow the same pattern of attack, which is in part because of the flow of combat that persists throughout those boss battles. A reactive flow of combat, to be precise. This type of combat centers around the opponent by making you react to their various moves and actions to overcome them. And as far as boss design goes, you kind of have to play in that manner, as Dark Souls bosses tend to be large in stature, with high damage attacks, and are completely unresponsive to any aggression done upon them. So you have to dodge or block their attacks until they leave an opening large enough for you to get some hits in. The only thing that changes by using a different weapon is going to be what openings you can take advantage of. Slow weapons can only take advantage of big openings, faster weapons can take advantage of smaller openings, and ranged weapons and magic vary based on their effects. Even the player design leads to that style of play, as the inability to cancel attacks once started means you have to be extremely sure of when and how you want to attack. And the stamina bar means that trying to be aggressive in combat will leave you without the energy to block or dodge the bosses, making you soak up those high damage hits. Because of this, even though the number of weapons is high, the options you have in combat is rather limited, and that's not even considering the fact that the leveling system and item stat requirements push the player to specialize in a certain type of stat, like strength, which limits the types of weapons you can use, despite there being a large number of them. For Sekiro, however, there are three main changes that let the player's approach to battle have more options. The first two are directly related and are the fact that the bosses now react to your attacks and the inclusion of a new posture system. Bosses reacting to your attacks might seem inconsequential at first, but you have to realize this is what gave the bosses so much control over the flow of battle in the older titles. Because no matter what you tried to do or how you played the game, the bosses simply continued what they were doing, leaving you no choice but to respond to their attacks. But now in Sekiro, bosses will recoil when hit, they will try to block your attacks, sometimes canceling their own attacks to do so, and even have set methods to retaliate once you've hit their guard too much. This changes that reactionary flow of combat into a flow that ebbs back and forth between the boss having control and the player having control. The posture system works into this by creating a method of defeating bosses that can take advantage of that new back and forth flow of battle. This posture system works by building up the posture meter through attacks on your enemy and successfully warding off their attacks with deflex and counters. After maxing out the posture meter, your opponent will be open to a killing blow, regardless of their remaining health. The posture meter will decay if no one is attacking, so to take advantage of it, you need to either be aggressive with your attacks or lure your opponent into attacking you to keep the meter from decaying. So, with the back and forth flow of battle and the new posture system, there are now different options you have when choosing how to approach combat. You could try and be as aggressive as possible, cancel as many enemy attacks as you can, and finding ways to redirect the flow of combat in your favor to fill out the posture meter, or you could take a more defensive stance, luring the enemy into your deflex and counters, essentially making them defeat themselves with posture damage. You could even ignore the new flow of battle and do things just like you could in Dark Souls and simply dodge and block, then hit the bosses when they have an opening. These decisions could also be made while in the midst of combat, like shifting to a reactionary style once you're low on health or healing items, or using the fact that the posture bar regenerates slower the lower the boss's health to switch to a more aggressive playstyle once they cross a certain health threshold. But while these changes allow for more options in your approach to combat, they don't really cover the options you have in the second-to-second combat and how you can take advantage of enemy attacks and openings. Which brings us to the third major change from the earlier Dark Souls titles, which is the fact that the main character, known as the Wolf, now has a fully available set of basic skills. These skills are his slash and thrust, guard and deflect, jump and step dodge, and depending on the environmental situation, the ability to use the grappling hook, each of which have their uses in battle. This is a huge difference from Dark Souls, which only has two, the ability to heavy attack and dodge roll. Now, I know what you're thinking. Dark Souls has way more abilities than those two things, and you're right, it does. You can also block, parry, use weapon skills, shoot ranged attacks, and use regular attacks. But while you have those abilities, none of them are available to you at all times. They are only available if you have the right items equipped the right way under the right circumstances. For instance, dual-wielding weapons means that you cannot block. Having spells equipped but no mana means that you get no regular attack, and parries can only be done with small shields or specialized knives. The fact that players don't have full access to all those abilities means that From Software can only design its bosses around those two basic abilities, so as not to exclude those who prefer a certain playstyle. For instance, there cannot be a boss that is only injured by ranged attacks, because that would harm any player that chooses to use melee weapons only, making their choices feel inept or forcing them to backtrack and grind until they can use ranged weapons, even though they don't want to. The director of both Sekiro and Dark Souls 3, Hidetaka Miyazaki, said as much in an interview with Game Informer, where he stated, "In a previous title, if you had an area or a boss that could only be defeated by magic, that would be an issue, because people are specializing in their build, and we've created this unnecessary wall for them. By increasing the basic set of available skills, it allows for bosses to be created with a much higher level of complexity, and at the same time allows for multiple options of dealing with that complexity. For instance, take the boss named Genichiro, who has a variety of attacks that can be dealt with in different ways. One such attack is where he jumps up in the air and quickly does a downward slash. This attack can be easily deflected for posture damage, but after you do, he will follow up with one of his unblockable attacks, which you can then deflect for extra posture damage. But you could also dodge backwards while he does his downward slash, which will prevent you from getting the initial posture damage, but lets you use a Mikiri counter on the follow-up, which does even greater posture damage. Or, when he jumps up, you can instead dodge to the side. If done at the right time, you can hit him from his blind spot and prevent any follow-up attack. There are also subtler methods that can be done, like how the headless guardian ape has a double sweep attack he uses, and if you deflect the last hit, he will transition into another flurry of attacks, great for defensive posture damage. But if you guard it normally, he just stops attacking, which is a great opening for health damage. These different scenarios become even more laden with options once you start weaving in the various unlockable gadgets and combat arts, which, unlike Dark Souls, build upon your basic set of moves and can let you exploit opponents' vulnerabilities even further. For example, look at the boss known as the Corrupted Monk. One of her attacks is a repeated spin with her Naginata. With your basic hit, the only viable options to deal with this are to either block the attack for its duration, or run far enough away that it can't hit you. But if you have the gadget known as the Mist Raven, you can fade into the mist and reappear behind her, which cancels her attack and gives you a brief window to do damage. There are also things like denying a boss's attacks by flipping them around with the Divine Abduction gadget, or blocking unique damage types with metal umbrellas, or using something like the Flame Vent as a follow-up to a successful jump counter. And the combat arts can provide unique types of movement, like using the Leaping Kicks art to bound over enemy sweep attacks, or using the Shadow Rush art to dash towards an enemy and launch yourself above them, but can also be used in place of normal attacks for different benefits like more health or posture damage, provided you have the time and means to use it. Having all these different options for dealing with enemy attacks and openings give the player a lot of freedom to evolve and explore how best to defeat each boss, which is a far cry from how the Dark Souls series and its singular style did things. But while From Software gave Sekiro Shadows Die Twice all of these new options for dealing with bosses, they can now create bosses that also deny some of these options to make unique fights that differ from the norms, in a way that Dark Souls couldn't because of the limitations of the two basic abilities and the reliance on reactive combat. Mid-bosses end up with some of the most interesting fights, such as the Armored Knight denying death blows, so you need to corral him to the side of the bridge, then shove him off at max posture, or the Centipede mid-boss, great name by the way, who is so unrelentingly aggressive that defeating him with defensive deflects is your only real tactic. Even some of the major bosses do this, such as the Demon of Hatred, who most closely resembles the bosses from the Souls series, as he's big, doesn't react to your aggression, and most of his high damage blows pierce your blocks and deflects, forcing you to focus on reactive combat by dodging and hitting in between his attacks. Or the two versions of the Corrupted Monk, where the real version is your typical boss fight, But the purple illusion version takes little posture damage and has high posture regeneration, making the approaches to these two fights radically different, as health damage is going to be a more viable choice on the illusion version. Having these types of challenges where certain skills or tactics cannot be used isn't some foreign concept either. Mario Odyssey does it when you enter a challenge door but lose the use of your hat and its subsequent mobility, and Shadow of War does it when it makes certain orc leaders immune to certain damage types or special attacks. And by doing so, they can let other aspects of the game shine, just as Sekiro does. But it also lets you create difficulty that goes beyond just it's big and does a lot of damage. So, From Software changed Dark Souls' boss formula. It's not as if that formula was bad either. Even with its simplistic tactics, From Software made bosses with unique and interesting attack patterns done in a wide variety of scenarios that managed to be both entertaining and difficult. Even though I knew I would still be reacting to all their moves, just as I had 1,000 times before. But Sekiro just feels so much better. I can enter a boss fight and not know how things might turn out. Which way should I approach this fight? How can I use my skills to deal with these attacks? Is there anything I can do to put things more in my favor? There are just so many options to try out and experiment with that each boss becomes an individual experience, because you can never just rely on doing things one way. Especially when From Software can wrest some of these options away from you at a moment's notice. Which is why I personally find Sekiro's boss fights to be a much more enjoyable experience, where anything can happen, and it's up to you to use your wits and your skills to defeat the challenge set before you.